Hello and welcome everyone. This is the 8th and final video in a multi-part presentation of the 4 Charters of American Freedom. The 4 Charters of American Freedom are the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the amendments to the Constitution. We discussed the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights in previous presentations. In this presentation, we will discuss the 4th Charter of Freedom, which is the remaining 17 amendments to the Constitution. So let's begin. As we discussed in the previous presentation, the Constitution is made up of a preamble or an introduction, and then 7 articles. The 5th article provides that the Constitution is a dynamic document that can be modified and updated over time to meet the needs of an expanding and evolving nation. Since its ratification, the Constitution has been amended 27 times pursuant to Article 5. The first 10 of those amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights has been discussed in a previous presentation. In this presentation, we'll discuss the remaining 17 amendments to the Constitution. Here we go. The 11th Amendment provided that states could only be sued in state court. This amendment arose out of concern that the Supreme Court overstepped its bounds in a specific court decision in 1793 that allowed states to be sued in federal court. States argued that this Supreme Court decision shifted way too much power to the federal government and away from the states. Okay, I find the 12th Amendment to be one of the more interesting amendments in the Constitution. The Constitution was originally written where Electoral College electors cast ballots with no distinction between president and vice president. The candidate receiving the most votes was then deemed president, and the candidate receiving the second most votes was deemed vice president. Then, in the 1796 presidential election, which was the first election following George Washington's second and final term, John Adams was elected president, and Thomas Jefferson was elected vice president. The issue here was that these two people were from opposing political parties and were unwilling to work together. For example, with the French Revolutionary War, President Adams supported a pro-British foreign policy, while Vice President Jefferson supported a pro-French foreign policy. Imagine, under this system in modern times, Hillary Clinton might have been Donald Trump's vice president, and Donald Trump might have been Joe Biden's vice president. Those pairings, on their face, appear entirely implausible given the caustic animosity among those parties. In the following election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, both from the same political party, received an identical number of electoral votes. This then triggered a prolonged contingent election in the House of Representatives, as dictated by the Constitution, that lasted for over 36 separate ballot counts and finally ended on February 17, 1801, with Thomas Jefferson as president. So, issues with the elections of 1796 and 1800 set the stage for a constitutional amendment to alter this flawed system where the 12th Amendment was ratified to provide for Electoral College electors to cast separate votes for president and vice president. Since the mid-1800s, no major political parties nominated more than one candidate for president and vice president. Further, modern elections have seen presidential and vice presidential candidates pairing up to appeal to broader base of voters. These traditions have further diminished the prospects of repeating the consternation that resulted in the election of 1796 and 1800. Okay, let's move on to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which are considered to be the Civil War Reconstruction Amendments. These amendments were principally designed to abolish slavery and unite the country under common rules of citizenship and equality. The first Reconstruction Amendment was the 13th Amendment that put an end to the ravages of slavery that marred the country since the early 1600s. The second Reconstruction Amendment is the 14th Amendment. This amendment was arguably the most important and the most controversial of the Reconstruction Amendments. Following the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision of 1857, where it said that African Americans were not citizens, this amendment declared that every person born or naturalized was a citizen of the United States. It also provided that due process and equal protections applied to all citizens and repealed the constitutional provision providing that slaves counted for only 3/5 of a person. Unfortunately, former slaves received rights under this amendment in name only, as institutionalized racism and oppression of African Americans continued to prevail throughout the United States. Finally, this amendment allowed Congress to prohibit former leaders of the Confederacy from holding office, and it exempted the federal government from paying Confederate states for the lost use of slave labor. The third and final Reconstruction Amendment was the 15th Amendment. This amendment was designed to protect the rights of African Americans to vote. Again, this amendment provided African Americans with a diluted voting right, as many southern states enacted barriers to black voting, including poll taxes, literacy taxes, and other discriminatory practices designed to prevent black voters. The promise of this amendment went largely unfilled until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Now let's move on to the 16th Amendment. This amendment followed a Supreme Court decision in 1894 that ruled income taxes to be unconstitutional. This amendment then gave Congress the power to enact a nationwide income tax that vastly expanded the federal government's source of revenue and spending. The Constitution finally gave state legislatures the powers to choose congressional senators. But disagreements between political parties often produced deadlocks in state legislatures that delayed the selection of senators, which often left the Senate without full representation for lengthy periods of time. The 17th Amendment removed the power to choose senators from the state legislatures and gave it to the voters of each state. Income tax revenue resulting from the ratification of the 16th Amendment that we just discussed freed the federal government from dependence on liquor taxes, and senators, now elected by the people following ratification of the previous 17th Amendment, were subject to greater pressure from advocates of temperance of alcohol. As a result, the 18th Amendment was ratified and essentially banned consumption of liquor throughout the entire United States. Following about a century of courageous work by women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton, and Lucretia Mott, among many others, the women's suffrage movement successfully lobbied for the 19th Amendment, which uniformly gave women the long overdue right to vote. Unfortunately, women of color continued to be subjected to various types of voter suppression, like poll taxes, until the passage of the Voter Rights Act of 1965. Following a long delay in the transition from outgoing President Herbert Hoover to incoming President Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression, the 20th Amendment was passed, moving congressional terms to begin on January 3rd from the previous March 4, and presidential inaugurations to be on January 20th from the previous March 4th. After more than a decade of attempted but largely unsuccessful abstinence from national alcohol, the 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition and the 18th Amendment and freed the country to consume alcohol again. As discussed in our previous presentation, our first glorious president, George Washington, established a tradition of no more than 2 terms per president. That tradition was broken by FDR as he guided the nation through the third and fourth terms during the Great Depression and World War II. Following the death of FDR, the 22nd Amendment was passed, limiting presidents officially to 2 terms. The 23rd Amendment provided residents of the nation's capital, the District of Columbia, with the right to choose electors in the same way that states do in federal elections. As we discussed in earlier slides, African Americans' voting rights fell short of what was anticipated by the Reconstruction Amendments, where in 1964, 5 states still had poll taxes that impeded black voters from casting votes. The 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes in an effort to continue to battle institutionalized voter suppression. The assassination of John F. Kennedy brought to light the Constitution's vague procedures related to presidential disability and succession. The 25th Amendment brought clarity to the issue by stating that a vice president becomes president rather than acting as president when the president dies. It also established procedures for filling a vice president's office on vacancy and established procedures for elevating a vice president to president if a president is unfit or otherwise incapacitated to be president. The 26th Amendment simply gave 18-year-old adults who were fighting in Vietnam the ability to vote in all U.S. elections. And then finally, in 1982, a college undergraduate student learned that an amendment to prohibit Congress from receiving a salary increase until after the end of the election was never ratified. He then undertook a successful effort to build support for ratifying the 27th Amendment. Well, that concludes this overview of the amendments to the Constitution. It also concludes the final presentation in this 8-part series on the Charters of American Freedom. We hope you enjoyed the series. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe.